Make him stop. Now Lincoln's voice rolled through the dining room, low and hard enough to make every waiter freeze. I'm trying, sir, the nanny whispered, pushing another toy toward the sobbing 3-year-old. For 20 painful minutes, the child's cries had trapped the entire restaurant in silence. Lincoln could make grown men kneel with one look, yet he sat helpless before a terrified little boy. His enforcers stood around the table like carved stone, daring anyone to stare. Fear could silence a room, but it could not quiet a child. Then Nova, still wearing her coffee-stained apron, stepped past the armed men. She set a warm plate on the mahogany table and looked straight into the cold eyes of the city's most dangerous man. He doesn't need another toy, she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension. He needs a mother, the air inside Laura. The city's most exclusive restaurant usually smelled of roasted truffles, expensive wine, and old money. Tonight it smelled like fear. Nova tightened her grip on a silver tray, her feet aching from a brutal double shift. For 5 years, she had survived by staying invisible. She kept her head down, changed her name, and let the world forget she existed. But some pasts do not stay buried. They wait, and tonight. Hers had walked straight through the front door. 30 minutes earlier, the heavy mahogany doors had swung open, and the restaurant seemed to lose all warmth. Lincoln entered without saying a word. He did not need an introduction. The silence that swept across the tables did it for him. He looked like a man carved from ice, dressed in a dark tailored suit that barely softened the violence in his broad shoulders. 3 enforcers moved beside him with the patient grace of wolves. But the strangest sight was the small boy clutching a plush rabbit, being pulled along by a trembling nanny. This was Leo, the reluctant heir to an empire built in shadow. He was too small for the weight already placed on his name. They took the secluded corner booth, and for the first 10 minutes, the restaurant stayed deathly still. Then a fork slipped from a waiter's hand and clattered across the marble floor. The nanny reached for Leo too quickly, and the anxious child panicked. His first cry was a small, breathless hiccup. The second cracked open into a wail. By the third, he was in full meltdown. For 20 minutes, the other diners stared down at their plates, too afraid to look toward Lincoln's table. Nova watched from the back station, crushing a damp rag in her shaking hands. Her heart beat hard enough to hurt. She knew that screaming boy. Not from the news. Not from street rumors. She knew him from a faded photograph hidden beneath her floorboards. Her dead sister Elena holding a newborn baby. Elena had run off to marry into that brutal world, blinded by the charm of a dangerous man. Nova had cut all ties, changed her name, and vanished into the city to stay alive. When Elena died in a suspicious car wreck 3 years later, Nova grieved alone, too frightened even to attend the funeral. She told herself hiding was survival. She told herself there was nothing she could do. But guilt has a way of breathing under closed doors. Now, looking at the boy's tear-streaked face and seeing her sister's bright emerald eyes staring back in terror, Nova felt something inside her split open. Across the room, the nanny bent close to him, whispering sharply while trying to force a silver spoon of pureed dessert into his mouth. Leo slapped the spoon away, splattering bright puree across Lincoln's spotless dark sleeve. The entire restaurant seemed to stop breathing. Lincoln looked down at the stain, then lifted his cold gaze to the nanny. His voice never rose, but the ice in it carried across the room. If he doesn't stop crying in 10 seconds, you will never work in this city again. Panicking, the woman grabbed the boy's arm a little too hard. Leo screamed, a broken sound that went straight through Nova's chest. She stopped thinking. The fear that had kept her hidden for 5 years snapped like thread. She dropped the rag, grabbed a warm plate of toast, and marched toward the boss. A massive guard stepped into her path at once, barking a warning as his hand hovered near a hidden gun. He expected the small waitress to back down. Nova did not even blink. She told him the child was already terrified, and his bullying was only making it worse. The guard froze, stunned by her nerve. Then Lincoln raised one scarred finger. That tiny movement was enough. The guard stepped aside. Nova reached the table, and the full weight of Lincoln's presence hit her. His face was all sharp lines, his dark eyes exhausted and empty. But she held her ground, because Leo was still choking on his own sobs, and no one in that room knew how to help him. Lincoln demanded to know who had allowed her to approach, his voice a quiet, dangerous rumble. Nova pushed out the fear. The armed men. The trembling nanny. All she saw was the little boy struggling to breathe through his tears. Seeing Leo look so much like Elena hit her like a fist to the heart. She set the plate of toast down hard enough for the porcelain to crack against the table, silencing what was left of the room. Then she said the words that would change her life. She told Lincoln his son did not need another shiny toy, and he did not need an army. He needed a mother. The guards tensed, waiting for the order to drag her away. Lincoln's cold eyes locked onto her, and the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The air felt thick, almost impossible to breathe. He asked what she had just said, his tone terrifyingly soft. Nova ignored him. She knelt beside the booth and faced the weeping child. Slowly she reached out and opened Leo's tight, shaking fists. Her voice softened into a rhythm she had not used in years. She whispered that it was too loud, too bright, and full of angry men. Leo sniffled. His green eyes found hers, and for the first time all night, he stayed still. Then Nova began to hum. She hummed a soft, melancholy melody from the old country, a lullaby about a silver moon and a sleeping wolf. Their grandmother used to sing it, and Elena had once promised she would pass it down to her children. As the notes left Nova's lips, Lincoln went rigid. The color drained from his hard face. His hand gripped the edge of the mahogany table until his knuckles turned white. Leo's ragged cries began to fade. He drew in a shaky breath, mesmerized by this stranger humming a song that somehow felt familiar. Little by little, the terror left his small body. He leaned forward and rested his wet cheek against Nova's rough apron. Nova wrapped her arms around him and buried her face in his soft hair. He smelled of baby shampoo and salty tears in silence. She promised him that his aunt was finally here, for 3 long minutes. The only sounds in that unbearable room were the child's steady breathing and the waitress's quiet hum. When Nova shifted to stand, she felt Lincoln's stare boring into her. He demanded to know where she had learned that song. His dangerous calm was gone. His voice cracked with something too human for a man like him, and he tried to hide it almost immediately. Nova froze. She understood her mistake at once. The shock of seeing her nephew had ruined all her careful planning. Keeping her eyes on the floor, Nova settled the sleeping Leo against the velvet cushions. She lied smoothly, saying her mother used to sing it, and that it was just an old common tune. Lincoln lowered his voice to a dangerous whisper. His late wife had sung that exact song, he said, and she had sworn it belonged only to her bloodline. Nova forced her face into polite confusion. She apologized, claimed she must have misunderstood, and turned to leave. But before she could pull away, a large hand closed around her wrist. It was not one of the guards. It was Lincoln. His grip felt like iron. "You are not going anywhere," Lincoln said. He shot a lethal glare at the nanny. "You're fired. Get out before I have Silas drown you." The woman stumbled away into the night. Lincoln turned back to Nova. "You put my son to sleep in 3 minutes. I haven't managed that in 3 years without him screaming." "What is your name, Nova?" she lied, holding tight to the life she had invented. He released her wrist. Then, "Nova, you no longer work here. You work for me now. You will care for Leo. You leave with us tonight." Panic closed around her throat. She whispered that she could not, but the decision had already been made. Nova understood the danger at once. Breathing the same air as a kingpin meant being studied from every angle, and for a woman hiding her past, attention could be fatal. If Lincoln ever learned she was the sister of the wife he believed had been murdered, she might not survive the night. He tossed a thick stack of $100 bills onto the table, cold payment for her stolen freedom, and told her he was not asking. The ride to his estate felt like being sealed inside a moving coffin. Nova sat frozen in the armored vehicle, cradling the sleeping boy whose tiny fingers clung to her apron. Lincoln sat in front, a massive shadow against the passing streetlights. Silas had eyes like flint and a jagged scar running down toward his collarbone. Through the rearview mirror, he studied Nova with cold suspicion. She sat inside that steel cage with the city's most dangerous men, feeling everything she had built for herself begin to vanish. Her quiet apartment, her safe name, her savings. All of it had disappeared in one evening. Yet as she looked down at the fragile boy asleep in her lap, Something inside her became clear. Her sister was gone. But this child was still here. A lamb surrounded by wolves. Nova could not leave him. The car finally passed through wrought iron gates and rolled over gravel toward a looming Gothic mansion. Places like that are rarely homes. This one felt more like a monument to fear. Stone gargoyles watched from the eaves, and red camera lights stared from every shadow. Silas killed the engine and offered a hollow welcome, carrying Leo across the threshold. Nova stepped into a cold world of dark wood and polished marble. It was a museum of wealth with no laughter in it, no toys on the floor. No photographs on the walls, only silence, guards and locked doors. Lincoln led her toward the east wing, shrugging off his heavy jacket. Without the force of his anger, the feared crime lord looked strangely empty, as if grief had hollowed him out from the inside. His instructions were cold and precise. Her room would connect to Leo's. She would give the boy her full attention. If the child bled, Lincoln said, she had better pray. Nova nodded, refusing to let her fear show, and followed Silas up the grand staircase. The enforcer moved without a sound, like a ghost passing through stone. In the dim corridor, he mocked her convenient rise from waitress to caretaker. Nova answered with a fragile lie about raising younger siblings. Silas smiled without warmth. He had already started memorizing her face, her voice, every small hesitation. He stopped before a heavy oak door and stepped too close, trying to remind her who had the power. Silas leaned in and whispered that while his boss was distracted by a quiet child, he saw everything. He promised to dig through her past until he found the truth, right down to her childhood grades. If she was a rival spy or police, he would bury her deep in the woods. Nova met his dead eyes without blinking. After 5 years of outrunning her own shadow, the threats of a loyal killer did not cut as deeply as he hoped. She stared him down and said an assassin would not have used toast as a weapon. Then she told him to open the door, for 1 second. His jaw tightened. He had expected fear. She gave him none. For a second, something close to respect crossed Silas's face. Then he opened the door. The bedroom was enormous and untouched, full of expensive things that had never been loved. A wooden rocking horse gathered dust in the corner, a symbol of a childhood put on hold. The bed was grand and oversized, far too imposing for a frightened toddler. Nova laid Leo down gently and pulled the duvet over his shoulders, watching his chest rise and fall. She finally broke. 5 years of grief for her sister rose inside her all at once. She traced the soft line of the boy's jaw and made a silent promise to Elena's ghost. She would keep him safe. The first week blurred into constant vigilance. Nova learned the estate's dark rhythm, how it moved like a machine powered by secrets. Guards crossed the lawns. Men in heavy coats arrived at night to whisper in shadowed corners. Lincoln moved like a ghost, disappearing into his study for days at a time. Nova kept her attention on Leo. She broke apart the sterile perfection of his room, pushed antique furniture against the walls, and carved out space for him to play. She demanded paints, blocks, picture books, and soft lamps instead of cold overhead light. The hardened staff scrambled to obey her, under Nova's steady warmth. The frozen shell around the traumatized child began to soften. Slowly, Leo stopped flinching whenever heavy doors slammed. Laughter began to echo through the grim halls. Nova's hidden link to Elena helped in ways no one understood. One morning, she slapped a strawberry tart from the chef's hands just before Leo could bite it, remembering Elena's old allergy and praying the child had inherited the warning too. The room went silent. Silas watched from the doorway, eyes sharpening as if he had just found a loose thread. Later that night, a torn page from Leo's medical file appeared under Nova's door, marked in red with one question. How did you know? Nova burned it in the sink, but her hands shook for an hour. One rainy afternoon, Nova sat on the carpet building a crooked tower of blocks with Leo. Lincoln appeared in the doorway, a massive silhouette against the hallway light. He noticed the boy's laughter in a voice that sounded half like a prayer, half like an accusation. Nova told him calmly that children laugh when they finally feel safe. Lincoln stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He knelt beside them, his huge frame awkward among the toys. With a scarred hand, he placed one block on top of the tower. It swayed, then held, Leo looked up at his father, green eyes wide with wonder, as if he had just seen a stranger become someone familiar. A bright smile spread across the boy's face as he cheered for his father. Lincoln released a heavy breath, as if he had been holding it since the day his world fell apart. For one brief second, the terrifying mob boss disappeared, leaving only an exhausted widower. He looked at the blocks and murmured that Elena used to build towers just like that. Hearing her sister's name from the man Nova had suspected of killing her sent a violent shock through her body. She forced her hands to stay still and said carefully that Elena must have been a good mother. Lincoln's jaw tightened. He said Elena had been the only light he had ever known. He admitted his empire was made of darkness, and Elena had been the only warmth inside it. Nova pushed her luck and mentioned the car accident, trying to test his guilt. Instantly, the grieving husband vanished, his eyes fixed on hers with the focus of a predator. The police and newspapers had blamed the rain and a tragic loss of control, but Lincoln leaned in, his voice dropping low, and said the brake lines had been cut. Nova's blood went cold. He had proof, he said. But the proof disappeared from his own safe before he could name the traitor. With chilling calm, he promised that when he found the person behind it, he would burn their bloodline to ash. Nova swallowed hard. The pain in Lincoln's voice was too raw to fake. He had not executed her sister. He was a grieving man, still in love, hunting the real killer in the dark. The revelation shook everything she believed. If Lincoln was innocent, then who had taken the proof from his safe? Before Nova could speak, Leo happily smashed his tower of blocks. The clatter cracked through the room like gunfire. Lincoln flinched, his hand flying to his waist for a weapon. His fragile humanity vanished. His eyes went cold, and he ordered them away from the glass, blaming the violent streets outside. As he marched out, Nova saw it clearly. This house was not only haunted, it was still under threat. As Lincoln disappeared down the hall, a cold realization settled over Nova. She was no longer a civilian protecting a child. She was trapped in the jaws of a syndicate war. The mansion was a maze, and at the center of it was a locked door on the 3rd floor. A frightened housekeeper had once whispered that the master's sanctuary was strictly forbidden. Nova felt certain that sealed room had belonged to her sister. For 3 agonizing weeks, she lived on a razor's edge, surviving Silas's relentless checks into her false identity. He asked the staff about her accent. He watched her hands when she signed receipts. Every shadow in the house felt like a loaded gun aimed at her back. 5 years earlier, Nova had bought her new name from an elite forger. On paper, her life was flawless and completely separate from Elena. But a lie is only as strong as the person forced to remember it. Silas was a bloodhound, waiting for her to trip over some detail from her real past. To survive, Nova needed to understand what had happened to her sisters inside those walls. If Lincoln was telling the truth about the missing proof, the killer might still be close enough to touch. The pieces shifted on a tense Tuesday, when Lincoln left the estate for a high-stakes summit meant to calm the growing syndicate war. Before leaving, Silas smiled at Nova from the foyer and slipped one black glove into his pocket. Lincoln took his men and left the estate in an unnatural silence. Nova put Leo down for a nap, then climbed the staircase to the unlit 3rd floor with her heart pounding. The air smelled of dust and old secrets. She gripped the cold handle of the mahogany door, locked, just as she expected. But survival teaches skills polite society never mentions. Before Elena married into crime, the sisters had grown up hard in the gutter, learning to pick locks because sometimes that was the only way to survive. Nova slid a bobby pin into the keyhole. For 3 long minutes, she stood in the suffocating quiet, feeling for the pins until a soft click answered her. Nova pushed the door open and stepped into a room frozen in time. The air still held the faint ghost of lavender and perfume. When the dim lights flickered on, her breath caught. This was not a bedroom anymore. It was a lonely mausoleum built by a broken man. Her sister's dresses hung untouched in the closet. The vanity was still crowded with silver brushes and glass bottles. Nova moved forward with tears blurring her vision. She picked up a brush and ran her thumb over the bristles, almost hearing Elena laugh. Then she noticed a small leather journal beside a brass lamp, half hidden beneath a silk scarf. With trembling hands, Nova opened the journal. The handwriting was Elena's, familiar enough to break her heart all over again. An October entry said someone watched her whenever Lincoln was away. Someone inside the house who hated how soft the baby made him. Nova turned the page with trembling fingers. Elena had found a hidden microphone in Leo's nursery. She had hidden it from Lincoln, afraid his paranoia would explode. Unsure whether a rival or a friend had planted it. The last line said she was fleeing to a safe house before dawn, and had hidden the proof where only family would think to look. It was dated one day before the crash. Nova felt her blood turn cold. The truth was worse than she had feared. Elena had known she was being hunted from within. But the journal did not name the hunter. Then a heavy bootstep sounded in the hallway. Nova froze. She had left the door unlocked. A low, rough voice slipped into the room. Silas. Nova spun as the door swung open. He stood in the frame, his eyes dark with lethal fury. A silenced pistol resting casually against his thigh. He had never gone to the summit with Lincoln. The whole departure had been a trap. Silas stepped inside and kicked the door shut. He admitted he had been waiting for her to make a mistake. She had been too perfect, he said, too good with the boy, too calm around fear. Silas sneered at the sight of her inside the forbidden shrine. Nova lied, saying she had only come to look for blankets for the child. Her voice stayed steady, even as adrenaline flooded her body. Silas moved closer and aimed the weapon at her heart. He said Lincoln saw her as a harmless pacifier for his son, but he saw a rat. He accused her of being a rival spy sent by the Moretti family to finish Elena's work. Nova backed away until her spine hit the vanity, insisting she was innocent. Silas spat in disgust and pressed the cold barrel to her forehead. His breath smelled of smoke and rage. He was not to question her. He was there to erase her. Silas said he had dug into her past, and her paper trail was too clean. Real people leave mess behind. Parking tickets, debt, embarrassing histories. But Nova had appeared 5 years ago as if she had been invented. He demanded her real name, threatening to splatter her blood across the vanity and claim he had caught a thief. Nova stared into his dead eyes and felt the trap tighten. The journal had not named him. Lincoln's missing proof could point to anyone. But then she saw the black glove tucked under his belt. The same kind Elena used to describe on the person who entered Leo's room. Nova whispered that he had planted the microphone. Nova accused him directly. He had stolen Lincoln's proof. He had followed Elena to the safe house. For 1 second, his eyes widened. It was only a flicker, but it told her everything. Silas sneered and tightened his finger on the trigger. But Nova's survival instinct moved faster than fear. She grabbed a heavy silver perfume bottle and smashed it into his face. Thick glass shattered across his cheekbone. He roared in pain, stumbling back as the gun went off. The bullet destroyed the vanity mirror, sending jagged shards raining over them both. Nova hit the floor and rolled, her palms slicing open on broken glass. But she forced herself to move. The fight shifted fast. Nova lunged and kicked the back of his knee. Silas buckled, then swung the pistol hard into her jaw. A white flash tore through her vision. She hit the floor, blood filling her mouth. Silas steadied himself and wiped blood and perfume from his eyes. He raised the gun again and whispered that curious women always died badly. Just before the shot could come, the mahogany door was kicked open. Lincoln stood there, chest heaving, his wet shirt clinging to him. He looked like something pulled out of a storm. Silas froze. Nova could not tell whether Lincoln had followed suspicion, instinct, or some private grief back to this room, but he was there. Silas began spinning his lie at once, claiming he had caught a spy desecrating Elena's room. Lincoln slowly took in the damage, the shattered mirror, his bleeding enforcer. Nova crumpled on the floor. The temperature seemed to fall, in a dangerously calm voice. Lincoln ordered Silas to drop the weapon. Silas tried to argue, but Lincoln's roar shook the walls. Reluctantly, Silas lowered the gun. Lincoln stepped inside and ignored his lieutenant, fixing his dark gaze on Nova instead. He ordered her to stand. She scrambled up, her jaw throbbing, her pulse slamming against her ribs. She had survived the executioner. Now she had to face the king. Lincoln turned and led them down the hall. The reckoning had arrived. His private study felt like a cavern of dark wood and old leather, lined with thousands of books that looked untouched. A single fire crackled, throwing nervous shadows across the floor. Lincoln took his place behind a massive oak desk. Silas stood beside him, stiff and furious, pressing a stained rag to his ruined cheek. Nova stood in the center of the room, exposed and alone. feeling like a lamb waiting for the butcher. Lincoln leaned back and steepled his fingers. His predatory stare settled on her as he demanded the truth. Silas tried to cut in first, desperate to frame her. Silas spat out his accusations. Her background was forged, he said. She had broken into Elena's shrine to steal secrets for a rival syndicate. He begged for permission to take her to the basement and force the truth out of her. Lincoln raised one hand, and Silas stopped at once. The boss said quietly that he had not been speaking to him. Then his terrifying focus returned to Nova. Who was she? Really, her mind raced in the firelight. If she accused Silas without the missing proof, Lincoln would believe his oldest friend over a stranger. The journal was still hidden upstairs. She had to choose every word carefully, or she would die before sunrise. Nova held her ground. She admitted her name was real, but her documents were not. Silas smiled with vicious satisfaction. Lincoln remained still as stone. In a soft, dangerous voice, he asked why. Nova began building the story she had rehearsed in her mind 100 times. 5 years ago, she said, she had witnessed a rival enforcer shoot a man. The police could not protect her, so she bought a false life and disappeared. Looking Lincoln in the eyes, she reminded him she had never asked for this job. He was the one who had taken her from the restaurant. That part was true, and the truth made the lie harder to break. She anchored the lie to the one thing left in Lincoln's heart. She told him she had stayed for his son, a child who needed comfort in that cold house. She had entered the forbidden room, only to find some trace of his mother. Something familiar enough to soothe his nightmares. Lincoln studied her, searching for any twitch or crack in her face. The silence stretched until the room felt airless. Silas mocked the story and begged to punish her. Then Lincoln snapped one word through the tension. Enough. He rose slowly and walked around the desk until he towered over Nova. Close enough for her to smell rain and cigar smoke on him. He whispered that she had lied to his face. In a rough whisper. Lincoln accused her of bringing a fake identity into his home and into his son's fragile life. Nova refused to shrink. She shot back that her forged papers were no different from his armed guards. Both were walls built to survive the night. Lincoln's eyes narrowed. When he lifted his hand, Nova flinched, expecting the blow. Instead, his rough fingers brushed lightly along her bruised jaw, tracing the place where Silas had hit her. The tenderness was so unexpected, it almost frightened her more. Without looking away from Nova, Lincoln ordered Silas to leave. The rival syndicate was moving, and every guard was needed outside. Silas stiffened, humiliated and furious. In the shadowed study, the balance of the house shifted in plain sight. Silas protested, furious at the thought of leaving Lincoln alone with Nova. But Lincoln was the one who ruled here. With a sharp command, he sent his lieutenant into the hall. Then Lincoln let some of the intimidation fall from his shoulders. He poured 2 glasses of amber whiskey and handed one to Nova, offering an uneasy truce. The liquor burned down her throat, steadying her frayed nerves. He admitted he still did not trust her story, but he also admitted something else. Since she arrived, his son's nightmares had stopped. His voice changed when he said it, softer than she expected, as if the words embarrassed him. Then Lincoln opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a cracked cassette tape sealed in plastic. He said it had been mailed to him after Elena died, with only half the audio intact. On it, Elena had whispered that someone inside the house was using Moretti names to turn Lincoln against her. The rest had been burned away before he could hear the name. Nova's stomach tightened. Elena had tried to warn him, and someone had made sure the warning arrived broken. Lincoln's terms were cold and clear. Nova would stay, but she was not free to wander. Tonight his syndicate was going to war with the Moretti family, and he ordered her to take Leo underground. The siege did not begin with a grand explosion. It began in suffocating darkness at 2 a.m. The estate's power grid was cut, dropping the whole empire into blackness. For one heartbeat, there was silence. Then the night tore open with shattering glass and automatic gunfire. Deep in the underground bunker, Nova was already awake. She sat on the freezing concrete floor, with her back pressed against the steel door. Emergency red lights bathed the room in a hellish glow. In the corner, Leo slept soundly, his small hands wrapped around his worn velvet rabbit. Nova had given him a mild sedative hours earlier to spare him the worst of the terror. Above them, the mansion became a war zone. Explosions shook dust from the concrete ceiling, and bursts of gunfire answered back. Proof that Lincoln's men were fighting hard. Nova's heart pounded against her ribs. She was no longer just a nanny. She was a woman locked in a steel cage, waiting to learn which monster held the key. If the rival family reached the bunker, she and the heir would be erased without hesitation. But an even darker thought crept in. What if the attack was not really from outside? What if someone had opened the gates from within? The thought made her stomach twist. The attack gave a traitor the perfect excuse for murder. That certainty hit Nova deep in the chest. Whoever had killed Elena would not wait for the fight upstairs to end. He would come for them now. Panic gave way to raw survival. She scrambled through the emergency supplies, finding bottled water, dry rations, and medical gauze, but nothing that could fire a bullet. Then her eyes landed on a heavy iron fire extinguisher bolted to the wall. It was not a gun, but it had weight. It could break bone. She tore it free and pressed her back to the wall as 10 agonizing minutes crawled by. Each blast above them sounded closer than the last. The tension pressed against the door like a living thing. Upstairs, the gunfire shifted closer to the main staircase. Then came a faint metallic scrape at the keypad outside the bunker. The digital locks were down. But there was a physical override key. Only Lincoln and Silas had one. A heavy clunk echoed through the steel frame. Chunk, chunk. Chunk, the deadbolt slid back. Nova raised the iron cylinder, every muscle tight, ready to swing for her life. The steel door groaned open, and a towering figure stepped into the red light. But it was not Silas. It was Lincoln, soaked in dark blood. There was no telling whether the blood on his torn white shirt belonged to him or to his enemies. His chest heaved with exhaustion, and a smoking assault rifle hung from his right hand. His wild eyes scanned the red-lit room until they found Leo asleep in the corner. A shudder passed through Lincoln's broad shoulders. A brief and beautiful collapse of the armor he wore for the world. Seeing it, Nova lowered her makeshift weapon and released a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. But before Lincoln could speak, the dark hallway behind him shifted. A cold voice ordered him to drop the rifle. Silas stepped into the dim light and pressed a pistol to his boss's skull. Silas looked ragged, blood oozing from a shrapnel wound in his shoulder. His face was twisted with desperate fury. He squeezed the trigger and ordered Lincoln to kick the rifle away. Lincoln stared back with quiet rage, but he stayed calm, sliding the weapon across the carpet until it stopped near Nova. He asked his oldest friend what he was doing, while their own men were bleeding upstairs. Silas sneered and called the invasion a distraction. Then he stepped into the bunker and kicked the steel door shut, locking them all inside. The sound felt final. Nova looked from the gun to Leo's sleeping body and knew the real attack had just begun. The confession came out of Silas with poisonous pride. He had given the rivals the perimeter codes, trading the docks for a massacre of his own brothers. He did not want money, he wanted the empire. He stared down the man he had once called family and accused him of going soft in their brutal world. Loving a good woman and trying to go legitimate was weakness. Silas refused to watch their legacy crumble, so he admitted the unthinkable. He had cut the brake lines on Elena's car, stolen Lincoln's proof, and burned the tape before it could expose him. Lincoln went rigid, a raw, guttural sound tore from his throat, the sound of a man being killed from the inside. To Silas, killing a mother had been nothing more than collateral damage, because Leo survived. Lincoln had collapsed into grief and become a ghost of a leader. Silas hated cleaning up after him while he mourned. Then his venom turned toward Nova. He pointed the gun at her and said she had found Elena's trail faster than expected. The woman had been clever, he admitted, hiding the nursery recording where only family would think to search. His plan was simple. Let the invaders kill Lincoln, execute the witnesses, and take the throne. Lincoln warned him that loyal men would never bow to a traitor. Silas laughed at that, a dry, ugly sound. Loyalty, he said, was only fear with a prettier name. Silas gave a hollow smile and reminded Lincoln that those loyal men were bleeding out on the floors above them. Lincoln's era was over. Nova's eyes darted from the discarded rifle to Silas, then back to Lincoln. She stepped into the line of fire and pleaded for him to spare the child. She offered to disappear with Leo and let Silas tell whatever lie he wanted. Silas only laughed. In his world, bloodlines were currency, and loose ends were meant to be cut. The boy, the nanny, and the king all had to die tonight. His gaze slid toward Leo's cot, and the last bit of color drained from Nova's face. This was where everything broke open. Silas shifted his aim toward the small cot where Leo slept. Lincoln roared like an animal and threw his body forward to take the bullet. The gunshot cracked through the tight concrete room, deafening and brutal. Lincoln stumbled back, dark red spreading across his shirt as he slid down the wall. Silas smirked and turned the hot barrel toward Nova. But she did not scream. She did not beg. Every hard lesson the streets had taught her came together in one burning point of purpose. She was not dying in that bunker, and neither was her sister's child. With a feral scream, Nova lifted the heavy iron cylinder and hurled it at Silas's skull. He raised an arm to block it, but the force shattered his forearm with a sickening crack. His pistol fired wildly into the ceiling. Nova did not waste a second. She dove across the carpet and grabbed the cold grip of the discarded assault rifle. She had never held a weapon like that before, but survival can teach faster than any training. Rolling onto her back, she raised the heavy barrel and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but the burst was clean. 3 rounds hit Silas in the chest. The shock on Silas's face was almost childlike. He stared down at his ruined shirt, opened his mouth in a hollow gasp, and collapsed before his knees could find the floor. The silence afterward was suffocating, thick with the metallic smell of blood and burnt cordite. Nova lay shaking on the carpet, her knuckles white, unable to let go of the rifle. A low groan pulled her back to herself. Lincoln was slumped against the wall, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. He looked at the dead man, then at Nova, stunned beyond words. His voice rasped that she had actually shot him. Nova barely heard him. She was already crawling toward the wound. Nova crawled across the floor and pressed gauze against Lincoln's wound with shaking hands, even with his life slipping away. Lincoln still carried the sharp paranoia of a crime boss. He grabbed her wrist and demanded to know who she really was. A waitress, he said, could not handle a combat rifle like that. The exhaustion of her lie finally broke her. Her false identity fell apart. Tears cut clean tracks through the dirt on her face as she gave up the truth. She swore no one had sent her. She had stepped into the line of fire because she had heard a little boy crying for the mother he had lost. Nova told him she could not leave a child with the same syndicate that had killed her sister. That word stopped Lincoln cold. His grip on her wrist loosened, dropping her fake accent. Nova looked the Mafia Don straight in the eyes. Her voice shook with years of buried grief as she told him her real name. Nova Rossi. Elena had been her older sister. The truth hung in the room, heavy and airless. Lincoln stared at her, reeling from blood loss and the impossible words. He stammered that Elena had always claimed to be an orphan. Nova answered sharply. Elena had lied to keep her out of danger. Nova pressed harder against his torn flesh, making him flinch, and let the old anger spill out. Elena had always known what kind of violent man he was. Nova had begged her to leave, and it had led to a bitter fight. Elena made the cruel choice herself. She told Nova to disappear so no enemy could use her as leverage. For 5 years, Nova lived like a ghost, pretending her sister was already dead so they could both breathe. Then came the news of the crash. Nova knew it had not been an accident. The underworld had swallowed Elena whole. She admitted she had wanted to storm in, take Leo and scream until her lungs gave out. But fear kept her frozen. Nova called Lincoln, what she had believed him to be, the monster who stole her sister. At that, the hardened shell around him cracked, leaving only a broken man. Lincoln stared at the flashing red light, his voice splitting as the truth hit him. Elena had not only protected Nova from rival families, she had protected her from him. Nova agreed quietly, but seeing Leo in the restaurant, seeing Elena's eyes in his face had ended her years of hiding. She did not care if Lincoln killed her now. Her only purpose was to protect that child. When Lincoln looked at her again, the suspicion in his eyes had burned away, replaced by something heavier than guilt. For the first time, Lincoln looked at Nova and saw the ghost of the woman he had loved, not in her face, but in the fierce fire in her eyes. He tested the word softly. Aunt Nova. She choked out a tearful yes. Above them, the gunfire began to fade, replaced by the booming voice of Lincoln's captain echoing through the vents. The tide had turned. The rivals were retreating. Lincoln's eyelids grew heavy as he murmured that the house was safe. The traitor was dead, and the enemies were running. Nova grabbed his fading face with blood-stained hands and begged him to stay awake. His son still needed him. Lincoln gave her a weak, heartbreaking smile, the kind a man gives when he thinks his debt has finally been paid. He whispered that his son had her now, as if leaving Leo with his mother's blood was the only way to keep him safe. Nova refused to accept it. The boy needed his father. Despite the empire of violence Lincoln had built, she could not let him die. She had seen the love he carried for his child. He was dangerous and deeply flawed, but he was still Leo's father. She ordered him to stay alive long enough to clean up his own mess. Then the heavy steel door beeped. Armed guards burst in, their flashlights cutting through the red haze. The captain rushed in, shouting for Lincoln, with a swarm of medics behind him. Nova was shoved aside and stumbled back until she hit the cold wall and slid to the floor. As the team worked frantically to stabilize him, Lincoln fought the darkness pulling at him. Through the blur of moving bodies, his eyes stayed fixed on Nova. With one bloody, trembling finger, he pointed at her and gave a direct order. She was untouchable. She was to be treated as family. The captain, stunned by the command, nodded sharply as they lifted Lincoln onto a stretcher and rushed him out, left in the quiet aftermath. Nova crawled toward the small cot. Somehow little Leo had slept through the gunfire and betrayal. Nova climbed onto the narrow cot and wrapped herself around her nephew like a shield. She buried her face in his hair, breathed him in, and finally let the adrenaline crash over her. The invisible waitress was gone. She was Nova Rossi again. Lincoln survived, though the recovery was brutal. For 2 tense weeks, the city waited for revenge. Reporters whispered about bodies that never appeared. The Morettas hid behind locked gates. Certain Lincoln would answer blood with blood. But from his hospital bed, Lincoln asked for only one thing: the full unburned nursery recording Elena had hidden. When the recording was found behind a loose nursery panel, Elena's voice finally came through whole. She named Silas, exposed the stolen codes, and begged Lincoln not to let her death become another war. Anyone who knew Lincoln expected retaliation, but it never came. He did not forgive the Morettas, but he refused to feed the trap Silas had built. He exposed the traitor, forced armed truces, and began tearing down the rotten pillars of his empire. The docks, extortion rings, and casinos were surrendered, sold, or burned down. His men whispered that peace looked like weakness. Then Lincoln played Elena's recording for them. After that, no one defended the old ways again. At last, the estate began to change. The staff had heard how the unassuming nanny had killed a traitor, and they now looked at Nova with a strange mix of fear and respect. One bright afternoon, she stood in the sprawling gardens while Leo chased a butterfly, his laughter ringing across the grass. Then the sharp tap of a cane on gravel caught her attention. Lincoln was walking toward them slowly, leaning heavily on a silver cane. He looked older, worn down by pain and recovery, but the terrifying tension that once lived in his shoulders was gone. He stopped a short distance away, his eyes softening as he watched his son run. Nova said softly that Leo had inherited his speed from his mother. She shared a bittersweet memory of racing down rusty fire escapes in the Bronx, where Elena never lost. A real smile touched Lincoln's face and reached his tired eyes. He said he would have loved to see that, moving carefully. He eased onto a stone bench beside her and exhaled as the pressure came off his wound. Looking across the lawn, he told her the surrender was complete. The empire was leaving the streets and moving into clean business. He knew his rivals thought he had lost his nerve. When Nova asked if that was true, Lincoln met her gaze and said he had finally found a reason not to die. Lincoln admitted Silas had been right about one thing. The weight of the underworld had killed Elena. Looking at Nova, he vowed he would not let that same violence take his son or destroy her. Nova looked down at her hands. The walls she had hidden behind for years were gone. She felt exposed. But for the first time, she was not afraid. She asked what happened now, reminding him she was only the waitress who had lied to him. Lincoln corrected her. She was the woman who protected his son and saved his life. Then he reached into his coat and offered her a velvet box. Inside was a silver locket. the necklace Elena had worn every day. Lincoln explained that Elena had left the locket behind before that final drive, and he wanted Nova to have it. Tears filled her eyes as she touched the silver. When she opened the clasp, she found a tiny photograph of herself and Elena from years ago, both of them smiling like the world had not touched them yet. Behind the photo, folded into the frame, was a thin scrap of paper. Elena's handwriting trembled across it. If Leo ever needs family, find Nova. Beneath the paper was a tiny brass nursery key, the place Elena had hidden the recording. Nova covered her mouth as the words blurred. Then Leo raced back with a proud handful of battered dandelions. Leo gave one dandelion to Auntie Nova and another to his father. Lincoln accepted the bruised little weed with great care, rolling the fragile stem between his scarred fingers, with emotion thick in his voice. He asked Leo if he liked having Auntie Nova around. The boy nodded without hesitation and said she sang him the moon song. Lincoln looked back at Nova and finally let his defenses fall. In that quiet glance, he was no longer the ruthless architect of a syndicate. He was a humbled father, asking the last piece of his family not to leave, smiling through tears. Nova promised Leo she was not going anywhere. Then she reached for Lincoln's scarred hand and held it. Years passed, but the change did not come easily. The Lincoln name slowly lost its bloody meaning and became something other than a symbol of revenge. The syndicate did not disappear overnight. It changed shape. The family name became linked to clean real estate, security firms, and quiet donations to children's hospitals. There were threats, trials and nights when old enemies tested whether Lincoln had truly put the gun down. Whenever that darkness crept back toward the house, Nova stood firm. She became the anchor of their fragile new world. Under her protection, Leo grew bright, curious and resilient, never knowing how close the shadows had once come to swallowing him. To Leo, the sprawling estate was simply home. It echoed with laughter, homework rules, and quiet evenings spent building wooden airplanes with his father. Stories like this often push us to expect romance, but Nova and Lincoln never married. Their bond was something different, forged from shared trauma and devotion to the child who carried Elena's memory. They became fiercely loyal co-parents. Eventually, they opened the terrible room on the 3rd floor. They saved what mattered and let the rest go. The dark shrine of grief was dismantled. In its place, they built a sunlit library for Leo, with Elena's recording locked safely behind glass, not as evidence anymore, but as a voice that had finally been heard. The heavy mahogany door that had once hidden the family's secrets was gone, replaced by clear French glass. On Leo's 10th birthday, the estate was filled with a fragile, hard-earned brightness. Children ran across the lawn while music drifted through the air. The chefs, no longer terrified of a violent outburst, proudly carried out a massive strawberry-free cake. Nova stood on the veranda, smiling at the chaos, her fingers resting on the silver locket at her chest. Lincoln stepped beside her with a glass of champagne. Peace had softened the ruthless lines of his face, and gray dusted his hair. He watched his son tear the wrapping paper from a new telescope. "He's happy," Lincoln murmured. Nova touched her glass to his. "He really is." Then her smile faded as she looked toward the library windows. Silas almost buried her voice forever. Lincoln nodded, his own gaze moving to the room where Elena's recording now rested behind glass. "But he didn't," he said, "because she knew someone would come back for Leo." Nova swallowed the ache in her throat. Elena had protected her son before anyone understood the danger. Lincoln raised his glass, grief and gratitude roughening his voice. "To the waitress who saved the empire." Nova touched the locket and corrected him. "To the mother who never left." They stood together in the warm sunlight, no longer broken creatures hiding in shadow. Side by side, they watched the boy they had bled to save, the boy who had unknowingly saved them both, look up at the sky through his new telescope, ready to find his own stars. Listen closely, because there is a painful truth in their story. Sometimes the bloodline we are born into is the very thing that breaks us. But the family we fight for can be what puts the pieces back together. Real strength is not found in ruling through fear. It lives in the courage to step into the line of fire for the innocent. If this story stayed with you tonight, hit the like button, share it, and subscribe.